Good morning. My name is Anderson Phillips, and today I'll be presenting the cult of charisma. When charisma replaces character in leadership. Prominent 19th century theologian, author, and Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon writes on the ruination of character, saying, "Character is always lost when a high ideal is sacrificed on the altar of conformity and popularity." While it is widely accepted that character and moral depth should remain central in leadership, especially in large-scale leadership, it can be observed that modern leadership has undergone a notable shift in values, where the esteemed virtues of humility, integrity, courage, and self-awareness once stood, now lie charm, emotional appeal, and media presence. In other words, modern leadership has dismissed and distorted character, ushering in the contemporary virtue of charisma. Although charismatic leadership is a captivating, persuasive, and powerful form of leadership, it is rooted in emotional manipulation and the suppression of reason. All leaders must appeal to the emotions and desires of their followers, especially as the scope of world leadership expands. However, the extent to which charisma has replaced character in leadership is unprecedented and has blinded many to the deceptive and unstable nature of charismatic leaders. The power and danger of charisma lie in the ability to persuade individuals, hinder independent thinking, and drive rapid change. These attributes of charisma make charismatic leaders more prone to becoming self-serving and abusive of their power. Charisma alone is not corrosive to organizations. However, when the stable and deliberative character is absent in leadership, followers and organizations will suffer. Undoubtedly, character-driven leadership is, as Charles Spurgeon writes, being sacrificed on the altar of conformity and popularity. While detrimental charismatic leadership is on the rise in the modern age, Paradise Lost by 17th century author John Milton demonstrates that charisma has roots in original sin. Satan lost the war and was cast down forever from heaven. The fallen angel awakens in a strange place, lying with the other fallen in a lake of fire, devoid of light, and in a constant state of physical pain. Stripped of his heavenly glory, he gazes upon his unfortunate comrades, knowing he led a multitude of angels who were serving their Creator in the perfection of heaven to an eternity of suffering, apart from God, in hell. Satan hoists himself from the lake of fire and begins to assemble his troops. He internally recognizes his hopeless state, and understanding that heaven is lost and God's authority is inescapable, he sets his sights on appealing to the demon's emotions, vices, and irrationality. He realizes the only power that remains is the power to persuade. Charisma takes root in the void where character ought to reside. Confident in his dishonesty, Satan speaks of their defeat as temporary, validates the demon's anger, and unites the demons to continue the fight against the powers of heaven. The demon's new plan hinges on corrupting God's precious creation, man. While innocent and curious Eve is unprotected in the garden, Satan appears to her, disguised as a serpent. Appealing to Eve's human nature, he flatters her, suggests that God is wrongfully withholding something from her, and shrewdly instills doubt of God's commands. Eve chooses to listen to the deceiver and sin. The serpent painted Eve's choice to sin, something she would have never done in her right mind, as both rational and wise. The enemy did not make Eve sin with force. Rather, he speaks and she listens. The danger of this serpent was not in his teeth, but in his tongue. As Solomon writes in Proverbs 18:21, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit." The word character derives from the Greek word character, meaning engraved mark or imprint on the soul. By way of metaphor, Hellenistic Greek shifted its meaning to signify a defining quality or an individual feature. In the modern age, the word character is more often used to signify a figure from a story. However, it still maintains its meaning as a distinctive quality, now encompassing also the concept of moral nature. Someone with good character is an exemplar of traits such as humility, integrity, courage, self-awareness, determination, empathy, and optimism. Based on Aristotle's Conversations on Virtue Ethics, modern philosophers have defined good character as having steady and permanent disposition to do what is good and refrain from doing what is wrong, having morally desirable wishes, desires, purposes, and goals, and having the tendency to respond emotionally toward things in the morally appropriate way. Charisma, a word also derived from Greek, originally meant divine gift. Today, charisma is used to describe someone with personal charm. However, Webster defines charisma as a personal magic of leadership, arousing a special popular loyalty or enthusiasm for a public figure, such as a political leader. While both charisma and character are prevalent descriptors in today's discussion of leadership, charisma is not the opposite of character. Rather, it is the mechanism by which character reaches people. Leadership, in its most ideal state, must strike a balance, a parallel between the two virtues of charisma and character. One Halloween night in Abilene, Kansas, in the early 1900s, a young boy pleads with his parents to let him go trick-or-treating with his older brothers. His parents refuse, saying he is too young. The boy is overwhelmed with rage and runs from his house, weeping and screaming, and begins pounding his fist on the trunk of an apple tree. With bloodied fists, he returns home, and his father lashes him and sends him to bed. While he is still crying, his mother enters his room. Instead of continuing to punish him, she bandages his wounds and quotes Proverbs 16:32, saying, "He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city." The young boy was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who cited this story from his childhood as a formative experience that made him who he was as a leader both militarily and politically. Eisenhower was raised in a small town in the prairies of Kansas, frequenting a Methodist church and taking after his father's quiet work ethic when completing chores for his family. Growing up in this environment instilled self-restraint and a strong moral philosophy. Eisenhower, as a leader, was characterized as someone with great charm and a magnetic personality. Fellow military leaders described him, saying, "His real strength lies in the human qualities. He has the power of drawing the hearts of men toward him the way a magnet attracts a bit of metal. He merely has to smile at you, and you trust him at once." Coupled with this captivating personality, however, was a set of disciplined habits, a settled disposition to do good. This moral code is exemplified most in moments when charisma cannot manage. For example, when Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, paced through the halls preceding D-Day with 2 notes in his pocket, one for victory and one for defeat, accepting full responsibility in the case of a loss. Eisenhower governed with the temperance instilled in him by his upbringing and led his country with dignity and moral responsibility. Character-driven leadership is the most universally accepted ideal model of leadership. However, just as history teaches of the imbalance of the scales of justice, it also teaches of the constant shifting of morals and values in society. Imbalanced leadership favoring charisma over character has been proven to lead to the abuse of power and manipulation. Renowned authors and thinkers, such as Yale professor and political commentator David Brooks, Harvard graduate and U.S. government consultant Daniel Sharow, and 19th century pioneer of crowd theory, Gustave Le Bon, have written extensively on the unstable power of unchecked charismatic leadership. In the early 1700s, France was drowning in debt following the War of Spanish Succession. The country's economy was desperate for stimulation and salvation from this depression. John Law, a young financier from Scotland, claimed he had a system by which he could restore France to its prior prosperity. Law was a particularly compelling man, well-groomed with a quick wit and audacious confidence. Despite Law's checkered past as a convicted murderer and serial gambler, his charm and charisma allowed him to forge a powerful connection with figures in France, enabling him to enact his plan. Law proposed that France replace its gold and silver coinage with paper currency, backed by the bank he founded. These banknotes appeared to be a tremendous success, both stimulating the economy and reducing national debt. Fueled Fueled by the success of this first financial plan, Law and his supporters turned their sights westward to the new and abundant land of North America. Law pledged riches and boundless prosperity to all who invest in his new company, the Mississippi Company. People trusted Law. He was known as a successful economist and had a cognitively disarming allure. His company, however, pledged riches that did not exist. The company's illusion fell, and the investors, many of whom had sold estates, property, and family heirlooms in order to invest, were left destitute. People lost faith in Law's banknotes, and France ended up in a worse economic state than it had begun. Law's charisma is what propelled him to power, while people ignored his character, resulting in the near collapse of a nation. The research conducted by David Brooks in writing The Road to Character lays a foundation for the ideal, character-driven leader, as well as warns of the dangers of narcissism, pride, and charisma in modern leadership. Charismatic leaders, especially those with narcissistic tendencies, abuse their power by taking advantage of symbolic status. Researcher Daniel Sankowski defines symbolic status as a psychological phenomenon, the tendency for followers to tacitly regard leaders as parental figures. While the authoritative bond between a parent and a child is undoubtedly strong, this type of bond belongs only to families. If a leader can harness the power of symbolic status, then he is likely to abuse and persuade followers to comply with unreasonable requests. This claim has been historically exhibited by both political leaders and, unfortunately, church leaders as well. Influential modern-day apologist Ravi Zacharias was posthumously exposed for sexually assaulting more than 20 women in various capacities over the course of his ministry. Zacharias was a profound speaker and an exceptionally amiable man. Victims of Zacharias pointed to his abuse of symbolic status, calling his demeanor toward them fatherly. Zacharias' status as a pastor placed him above reproach in the minds of his followers. What began as innocent paternal trust was twisted by Zacharias and used for exploitation. This is evidence that a charismatic leader proves to be powerful and driven at first, but that drive quickly becomes self-serving and leads to the abuse of power. In cases of poor leadership, character is the missing component, especially when charisma is in overabundance. If a leader relies solely on charisma, the much-needed strong and lasting foundation is lacking, which can result in the collapse of organizations. Charisma creates a following, while character establishes a foundation. Charisma is a powerful tool in leadership, as it can disarm followers' ability to reason, allow quick persuasion, and drive large amounts of change in an organization. Since charisma has been proven to lead to the abuse of power and manipulation, why do people put such faith in charismatic leaders? The answer lies in the first point listed above: the disarming of followers' ability to reason. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech is a display of rhetorical charisma. King persuaded the masses and drove major change in America. His charisma, however, is authentic. It is rooted in something greater than himself. Authentic charisma can be rooted in religious beliefs, a moral cause, or service to followers. Contrarily, President Donald Trump's Save America speech preceding the riots of January 6, 2021, is a recent display of narcissistic charisma used to evoke loyalty to himself, hinder his followers' ability to reason, and rapidly call a crowd to action. Both leaders used repetitive phrases in their speeches, King repeating, "I have a dream, let freedom ring, and now is the time," and Trump repeating, "Stop the steal, fight like hell, and we will never give up, we will never concede." King called for radical unity in the people of America, while Trump's speech incited disunity and separation from the other side. Trump called his followers, quote, "the true patriots and the real people of America," while referring to the opposing political party as, quote, "traitors." Trump instilled a crisis mindset in his followers, further prompting change, saying that the left wants to, quote, "steal the election," and that we must, quote, "save our democracy." Trump's crisis rhetoric and display of narcissistic charisma undoubtedly escalated tensions and was arguably the catalyst for violence, vandalism, and death, while the authentic charisma of King prompted civil justice and unity. Trump's speech, only 70 years after King's, shows how unbalanced modern political rhetoric has become. How the scale has shifted from logical authenticity driving change to emotional indoctrination driving change. How has American leadership become this perilous? The power of charisma to drive change, hinder independent thinking, and persuade individuals is why charismatic narcissism is so dangerous. When a group of people is in a time of need, it is significantly more vulnerable to the persuasion of a charismatic leader. This is largely because charismatic leaders rely heavily on emotional pull, compelling rhetoric, and the ability to control or hypnotize a crowd. Charismatic leaders step into a crisis and promise salvation, often painting themselves as the only way to salvation. For example, 1920s Germany was suffering greatly from the aftermath of World War I. Economic depression, hyperinflation, and mass unemployment. This clear crisis morphed into the most notable display of narcissistic charisma throughout all of history: Hitler's rise to power and rule over Germany. Hitler came to power and defined a common enemy as the source of the nation's crisis. Similar narratives to this have allowed for the rise of many modern political tyrants, such as Fidel Castro, Benito Mussolini, and Saddam Hussein. Additionally, perceived crises can be just as powerful as real ones. Charismatic leaders can manufacture crises, feeding into followers' fears, fueling a crisis mentality, and amplifying their own power by way of the vulnerable state of their followers. Society must be more wary of charismatic leaders, as they're becoming more powerful, prevalent, and dangerous in the modern world. It is often assumed that having a leader who's predominantly driven by character is not profitable in this world. Leaders must be cutthroat, quick, and concerned chiefly with practical success. Can great practical success and moral depth coexist? It is often preached that you must be extraordinarily competitive, cut corners, and promote yourself in order to be successful as a leader of an organization. An unwritten proverb of modern capitalist societies is that virtue doesn't pay the bills. Diane Belcher, author for Harvard Business Impact, argues that the previous assertion is not true, that moral depth and practical success can and often do coexist. In her article, The Case for Leadership Character, Belcher writes, "Research shows that organizations with leaders who achieve high character scores have an average return on assets 5 times higher than those with low character scores. Leaders in the study were graded on traits such as humility, integrity, self-awareness, determination, empathy, optimism, and open-mindedness. The results of this study conclude that hiring and fostering character-driven leaders is not only morally wise, but also economically advantageous." Harvard business professor Max H. Bejerman argues that the impact of one character-driven leader in a senior role of an organization is exponential. He writes, "Leaders can do far more than just make their own behavior more ethical. Because they are responsible for the decisions of others as well as their own, they can dramatically multiply the amount of good they do by encouraging others to be better. As a leader, think about how you can influence your colleagues with the norms you set and the decision-making environment you create." These objections shed light on existing tensions in modern leadership. Organizations often do reward charismatic and ostentatious leaders. The efficiency and rapid growth perceived as the result of a charismatic leader seem undeniable. However, prevailing evidence suggests that these objections do not undermine the importance of character in leadership. Research shows that in the long term, character, although perhaps slower and less exciting, provides a universally advantageous stability. Additionally, moral character does not only apply to one religion or worldview. One does not need to be religious in order to be selfless, courageous, and honest. Modern philosopher Jeffrey Morgan asserts, "Quite clearly, there are millions of people who live moral lives without the assurance of a moral order in the universe brought about by religion. As charisma fluctuates with societal preferences, character endures for centuries. Still, charisma itself is a tool in moderation, a tool that could change the world for good if properly wielded alongside character. For these reasons, character continues to triumph over charisma as the chief virtue of leadership. Continually amplified by the growth of social media and the public's constant hunger for novelty, charismatic leadership is becoming increasingly prevalent in today's society. Organizations continue to prioritize popularity over principle, which will result in the breakdown of social and political structures. Character has remained as the cornerstone of lasting leadership for centuries. It is the only foundation of leadership universally proven to benefit organizations. Powerful charm must be complemented with depth. Leaders must choose character. The burden, however, lies equally, perhaps more so, on followers. Moral literacy and the ability to recognize charismatic deception are imperative skills for modern voters to possess. Critical thinking and discernment act as guardrails against abuse. Thomas Jefferson insists upon this, saying, "An educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as free people." Although harm may not be immediate, blindly following world leaders is a moral and ethical risk. Charisma has won when followers believe they are immune to deception. Followers have the power and the responsibility to stop abuse before it takes root. Additionally, King Solomon writes in Proverbs 31:30, "Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting. While charisma fades and charm wanes, character will stand strong." Thank you. I would now like to take questions from the judges.
I'll start. Excellent job.
Thank you.
You talked about President Eisenhower's D-Day notes and the one, hey, we won, or the battle went well, and the other one that the battle didn't go well, and I'm taking full responsibility of that, which is a testament to his leadership, as you're talking about. I don't know the answer to this question, maybe you do, whether those two notes were disclosed prior to the D-Day or if they were uncovered after, because I think it would be different if he told the soldiers at Normandy, we could win, we could lose. And that brings me to my question, and is we obviously have presidential leadership in case studies and different people, different styles, but CEOs of corporations are more prevalent. And I wonder how much, in your research, in your thought of CEOs having to disclose. Obviously, we have disclosure laws with relates to securities, and if they know something is not working right, they should disclose that, or they could be criminally penalized for not disclosing some pertinent information that could affect stock prices, for example. But there oftentimes are decisions, like President Eisenhower's, that they may not want to lay all the cards on the table, because they do need to be optimistic. They do need to say, we can do this. They don't want to show weakness sometimes. So how much of being a charismatic leader, when you also want to be a principled leader, how do CEOs do that when they may have trouble disclosing the whole truth, nothing but the truth, for fear of making themselves look weak and their company look weak?
Yes, sir. I think I understand your question. I'm not arguing for the abolition of charismatic leadership. I'm rather arguing for a balance between the two.
Right.
I'm not saying that a leader needs to be boring and sit up here behind a podium and do a PowerPoint slide and just work through things in the most boring of ways. I think that is not effective leadership. I'm arguing for the most effective model of leadership, which is the marriage of charisma and character, especially in the modern age, especially when CEOs have such immense power and such immense access to everyone in the world. They can tweet something and everyone will see it. I'm arguing that the scale has increased of charismatic leadership. The consistency with which we are being exposed to charismatic leaders has increased, and the power of charismatic leaders has increased. I'm not arguing that leaders shouldn't be charismatic. I'm arguing that we need to be more wary due to the access that they have to our attention.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'll go. I think my question aligns to that. I subscribe to John Maxwell's belief that leadership is really just influence, right? And I think in order to be influential, I have to be charismatic, But so what are some concrete observations that we might see? You mentioned the difference between Martin Luther King Jr. and Trump and Hitler. What are some concrete observations that we might see that, like, you're leaning out of the good side of charismatic into the negative aspect?
I think the main telltale sign is the goal, the end goal. I think that's the purpose of the leader's actions. I think that is the main goal. If you can discern the purpose of their actions, if Martin Luther King was saying his "I have a dream" speech in order to gain himself power, we could say, oh, okay, that's narcissistic charisma, that's manipulative charisma. But if you see someone who's using their rhetoric and using their appeal in order to gain their own power and just perpetuate their own prosperity, I think if you can discern the purpose, that's really the main key factor in seeing if it's good charisma or bad charisma.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll follow up on that. Where in our education system do we introduce discernment? Like where should we, I think your quote from Thomas Jefferson said an educated population, but there are smart people, there are educated people who also get drawn into bad plans from charismatic leaders. So where is discernment potentially introduced along the way, or where should we introduce it?
I can't speak to the whole population or to other schools, but I know that in our own school, we've been taught discernment every step of the way. We've been disciplined, had our clips moved up until you get to high school and you're getting demerits and you're getting told what's right and what's wrong. And I think that where I've learned discernment is in reading some of the texts that we've read here, like Republic by Plato, where he says it's better to be thought unjust and be just rather than to be thought just and to be unjust. Essentially what he's saying is it's better to be a good man who other people think is bad than to be a bad man who everyone thinks is good. My point in saying that is that I've been taught through this school that the worldly outward things do not matter as much as this battle against self-exaltation and this battle against selfishness. That's where I've been taught discernment. That it's about others, it's about benefiting the kingdom of God rather than benefiting myself.
All right. So as a leader of a school, a leader of a church, a leader of anyone, where do you find that balance? Because you know you have to have it. So how do you find the balance between good charisma and good character?
That's a great question. I think, like I said to Dr. Brown, the balance is found where your purpose is still in mind, and where your purpose is the utmost priority, I guess. Whenever everything else starts to overtake your purpose, whenever worldly prosperity, whenever riches start to overtake your main goal, that's whenever you realize that I'm going too far towards the charisma side and I'm not saying rooted in the character aspect of leadership.
Anderson, great job. As a recovering youth pastor, there was a lot of riz. It's a great job. No. My question, you mentioned about Paradise Lost, John Milton, him connecting charisma to roots in original sin. Do you agree with that? Do you think that charisma is rooted in original sin?
Yes, sir. I think that. Are you saying? Can you expand on that?
So in your paper, you said that John Milton demonstrates that charisma has its roots in original sin.
Yes, sir.
So is charisma birthed out of a sin, or does it come from somewhere else?
Well, so previously in that paragraph, I said, while detrimental charismatic leadership is on the rise in the modern age, I think that what I was trying to portray through that is that detrimental charismatic leadership, charisma, like I've said, manipulative charisma or narcissistic charisma has its roots in original sin. Where Satan, as I demonstrated in that paragraph, Satan used his persuasion, he realized the only power that remains is his power to persuade. And that is where charisma being used for bad, that's where that came from. Him softly speaking to Eve and saying, surely God doesn't want to hold this from you. God wants you to prosper. God wants you to be knowledgeable. He said, that's the same thing that we see today in our leaders. Surely you understand what I'm saying? Yes,
So then, if it can break either way, that charisma is not inherently good or inherently bad, your argument then is character.
Yes, sir.
How do we continue to develop that as we vote for people, as we become people of influence? What would just your clear takeaway be? How do we continue to develop that?
I think that character is something that's grown. You hear the phrase all the time, that builds character. It's cliche, but things build character. There are things that build character. I think that suffering and continuing to push for a goal through suffering builds character. Education builds character. And all in all, hard things build character. I think that's the core takeaway, is that this life is hard, and being able to persevere through these hard things is what's going to build you to be a better leader. And I've observed that through all of the leaders that I've studied that exhibit good character.
Awesome. Good job.
If there are no further questions, thank you.